Chapter 1. The Cavendish Laboratory. I have never seen Francis Crick in a modest mood. This has nothing to do with his present fame. Already he is much talked about, usually with great respect, and one day he may be considered an equal to Rutherford or Bohr. But this was not true when, in the autumn of 1951, I came to the Cavendish Laboratory of Cambridge University to join a small group of physicists and chemists working on the structure of proteins. At that time, Francis was 35, but almost totally unknown. Although some of his colleagues respected his quick mind and frequently asked his advice, he was often not appreciated, and most people thought he talked too much. Leading the unit to which Francis belonged was Max Perutz, an Austrian-born chemist who came to England in 1936. He had been collecting X-ray diffraction data from protein crystals for over 10 years and was just beginning to get results. Helping him was Sir Lawrence Bragg, the director of the Cavendish. For 40 years, Bragg, a Nobel Prize winner and one of the first crystallographers, had been watching X-ray diffraction methods solve structures of increasing difficulty. In the immediate post-war years, he was especially keen on the possibility of solving the structure of proteins, the most complex of all molecules. Somewhere between Bragg the theorist and Perutz the experimenter was Francis, who occasionally did experiments, but was more often interested in theories for solving protein structures. Often he had a new idea, became enormously excited, and would immediately tell anyone who was willing to listen. A day or two later, he would often realize that his theory did not work, and return to experiments, until he got bored with them and turned again to theory. These ideas brought an atmosphere of excitement to the laboratory, where experiments usually lasted several months to years. This came partly from the volume of Crick's voice. He talked louder and faster than anyone else, and when he laughed, everyone knew where he was in the Cavendish. Most people enjoyed these exciting moments, especially when we had time to listen closely and to tell him when we lost the logic of his argument. But there was one significant exception. Conversations with Crick frequently upset Sir Lawrence Bragg, and the sound of his voice was often enough to make Bragg move to a safer room. Only infrequently would he come to tea in the Cavendish, since it meant he had to hear Crick's loud voice in the tea room. Even if he stayed away, Bragg was not completely safe. On 2 occasions, the corridor outside his office was flooded with water pouring out of a laboratory in which Crick was working. Francis, with his interest in theory, had not properly connected the rubber tubes to his pump. At the time of my arrival, Francis's theories spread far beyond the boundaries of protein crystallography. Anything important would attract him, and he frequently visited other laboratories to see which new experiments had been done. Though he was generally polite to colleagues who did not realize the real meaning of their latest experiments, he did not attempt to hide this fact from them. Almost immediately, he would suggest a number of new experiments that would confirm his analysis. Moreover, he could not stop himself from later telling anybody who would listen how his clever new idea might move science forward. As a result, an unspoken but real fear of Crick existed, especially among his more junior colleagues. The quick manner in which he seized their facts and tried to make sense of them frequently made his friends worry that he would actually succeed. This would show the world the loose thinking that was hidden behind the good manners and polite conversation of the Cambridge colleges. Though he had the right to dine 1 night a week at Caius College, Francis did not belong to the staff of any college. Partly, this was his own choice. Clearly, he did not want the unnecessary responsibility of teaching students. Another problem was his laugh, against which many academics would certainly rebel if they had to hear it more than once a week. I'm sure this occasionally bothered Francis, although he knew that most college dinners were dominated by boring, middle-aged men incapable of either amusing or educating him. His friends, who knew he was an entertaining dinner companion, made much effort on his behalf, but they were never able to hide the fact that Francis might get into an argument with anyone present at the table. Before my arrival in Cambridge, Francis only occasionally thought about deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and its role in genetics. This was not because he thought it was uninteresting, quite the opposite. A major reason why he had left physics and developed an interest in biology had been the reading in 1946 of What is Life? By the respected theoretical physicist Erwin Schrödinger. This book stated the belief that genes were the most important parts of living cells, and that to understand what life is, we must know how genes act. When Schrödinger wrote his book, 1944, there was a general acceptance that genes were special types of protein molecules. But almost at the same time, the bacteriologist O.T. Avery was carrying out experiments in New York which showed that physical characteristics could be passed from one bacterial cell to another by purified DNA molecules. Since DNA was known to occur in the chromosomes of all cells, Avery's experiments strongly suggested that future experiments would show that all genes were made up of DNA. If true, this meant to Francis that DNA, not proteins, would provide the key to enable us to find out how the genes determined, among other characteristics, the colour of our hair and eyes, probably our intelligence, and maybe even our ability to amuse others. Of course, there were scientists who thought that the evidence favouring DNA was unclear, and preferred to believe that genes were protein molecules. Francis did not worry about them. One could not be a successful scientist without realizing that, in contrast to the popular belief supported by newspapers and the mothers of scientists, a large number of scientists are not only narrow-minded and dull, but also just stupid. Francis, however, was not then prepared to jump into the DNA world. Its basic importance did not seem a strong enough reason to lead him out of the protein field, which he had worked in for only 2 years, and was just beginning to understand thoroughly. In addition, his colleagues at the Cavendish were only slightly interested in the nucleic acids, and even in the best of financial circumstances, it would take 2 or 3 years to set up a new study group which would use X-rays to look at the DNA structure. Moreover, such a decision would create an awkward personal situation. At this time, molecular work on DNA in England was considered to be the personal property of Maurice Wilkins, who worked at King's College London. Like Francis, Maurice had been a physicist and also used X-ray diffraction as his principal method of study. It would have looked very bad if Francis had jumped in on a problem that Maurice had worked on for several years. The matter was even worse because the two, almost equal in age, knew each other quite well. Maurice was unmarried, and before Francis remarried, they had frequently met for lunch or dinner to talk about science. It would have been much easier if they had been living in different countries. In England, all the important people, if not related by marriage, seemed to know each other, and it would have been seen as unfair for Francis to move in on Maurice's problem. In France, where this sense of unfairness did not exist, these problems would not have occurred. The States would also not have permitted such a situation to develop. One would not expect someone at Berkeley to ignore a challenging problem just because someone at Cal-Tech had started first. In England, however, it simply would not look right. Even worse, Maurice continually annoyed Francis by never seeming enthusiastic enough about DNA. Moreover, it was increasingly difficult to take Maurice's mind off his assistant, Rosalind Franklin. He was not in love with Rosie, as we called her from a distance, just the opposite. Almost from the moment she arrived in Maurice's laboratory, they began to upset each other. Maurice, a beginner in X-ray diffraction work, wanted some professional help, and hoped that Rosie, a trained crystallographer, could speed up his work. Rosie, however, did not see the situation this way. She claimed that she had been given DNA as her own problem, and she refused to think of herself as Morris's assistant. I suspect that in the beginning, Morris hoped that Rosie would calm down. But she was a determined woman. By choice, she did not emphasize her female qualities. Though her features were strong, she might have been quite attractive if she had taken even a mild interest in clothes. She did not. There was never any lipstick to contrast with her straight black hair, while her dresses showed no imagination at all. So it would have been easy to believe that she was the product of a dissatisfied mother who emphasized the importance of a professional career as an alternative to marriage to a dull man. But this was not the case. In fact, she was the daughter of a comfortable and cultured banking family. Clearly, Rosie had to go or be controlled. The former was obviously preferable because her aggressive moods made it very difficult for Morris to think in peace about DNA. There were times when he could see some reason for her complaints. For example, King's had 2 social rooms, one for men, the other for women. Certainly an arrangement from the past. But he was not responsible, and it was no pleasure to be blamed for the fact that the women's social room was small and dirty, while money had been spent to make him and his friends more comfortable when they had their morning coffee. Unfortunately, Morris could not see any decent way to sack Rosie. First, she had been given the impression that she had a job for several years. Also, she had a good brain. If she could keep her emotions under control, there would be a good chance she could really help him. But hoping and waiting for relations to improve was taking a chance, since Caltech's great chemist Linus Pauling was not limited by the rules of British fair play. Sooner or later, Linus, who was just 50, was bound to try for the most important of all scientific prizes. We knew that Pauling could not be the greatest of all chemists without realizing that DNA was the most golden of all molecules. Moreover, there was definite proof. Morris had received a letter from Linus asking for a copy of the crystalline DNA X-ray photographs. After some hesitation, he wrote back saying he wanted to look more closely at the data before releasing the pictures. Chapter 2. The Alpha Helix. It was Wilkins who had first excited me about X-ray work on DNA. This happened in Naples, when a small scientific meeting was held on the structures of the large molecules found in living cells. Then it was the spring of 1951, before I knew of Francis Crick's existence. Already I was much involved with DNA, since I'd been sent to Europe to learn its biochemistry. My interest in DNA had grown out of a desire which started while I was a senior in college to learn what the gene was. Later, in graduate school at Indiana University, it was my hope that the gene might be solved without me learning any chemistry. This was partly due to laziness as a student at the University of Chicago, where I had managed to avoid taking any chemistry or physics courses which looked of even medium difficulty. Briefly, I was encouraged to learn chemistry at Indiana. But after I used a bare flame to warm up some petrol, I was excused from doing any more. It was safer to allow an uneducated PhD than to risk another explosion. So I managed to avoid learning any chemistry until I went to Copenhagen, to work with the biochemist Hermann Kalka. Travelling abroad at first seemed the perfect solution to the complete lack of chemical facts in my head, a condition at times encouraged by my main teacher at Indiana, the Italian-trained bacteriologist Salvador Luria. He hated most chemists, especially those who did commercial work. Kalka, however, was obviously a civilized man, and Luria hoped that while working with him, I would learn something about the subject. Then Luria's experiments mainly dealt with the multiplication of bacterial viruses. For some years the suspicion had existed among the more original thinkers in genetics that viruses were a type of basic gene. If so, the best way to find out what a gene was and how it copied itself was to study viruses. So, because the simplest viruses were the bacterial ones, a growing number of scientists between 1940 and 1950 began to study them. Leading this group were Luria and his German-born friend, the theoretical physicist Max Delbruck, who was then in a senior position at Caltech. While Delbruck kept hoping that purely genetic tricks could solve the problem, Luria more often wondered whether the real answer would come only after the chemical structure of a virus, gene, had been cracked open. Deep down, he knew that it is impossible to describe the behavior of something when you do not know what it is. So, knowing he could never make himself learn chemistry, Luria felt the best thing would be to send me, his first serious student, to a chemist. He had no difficulty deciding between a protein chemist and a nucleic acid chemist. Though only about 1/2 the mass of a bacterial virus was DNA, the other half being protein, Avery's experiment made it seem like the essential genetic material. So working out DNA's chemical structure might be the essential chemical step in learning how genes copied themselves. However, in contrast to the proteins, the solid chemical facts known about DNA were very few. Only a few chemists worked with it, and except for the fact that nucleic acids were very large molecules built up from smaller building blocks, the nucleotides, there was almost nothing chemical that the geneticist could begin to work with. Moreover, the chemists who did work on DNA were almost always organic chemists with no interest in genetics. Kalkar was a bright exception. In the summer of 1945, he had come to the laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, to take Delbruck's course on bacterial viruses. So both Luria and Delbruck hoped that the Copenhagen laboratory would be the place where chemistry and genetics might combine to produce an advance in biology. Their plan, however, was a complete failure. Hermann Kalkar did not manage to interest me at all. I found myself just as bored by nucleic acid chemistry as I had been in the States. This was partly because I could not see how the type of problem he was working on then would lead to anything of immediate interest to genetics. There was also the fact that, though Hermann was obviously civilized, it was impossible to understand him. I was able, however, to follow the English of Hermann's close friend, Ole Marlow. Ole had just returned from the States, Caltech, where he had become very excited about the same bacterial viruses on which I had worked for my degree. On his return, he gave up his previous area of work and was now spending all his time on them. Then he was the only Dane working in this area, and so was quite pleased that I and Gunther Stent, a bacterial virus worker from Delbruck's laboratory, had come to work with Hermann. Soon, Gunther and I found ourselves going regularly to visit Ole's laboratory, which was several kilometers from Hermann's, and within weeks we were both actively doing experiments with Ole. At first, I occasionally felt uncomfortable about this, because I had been sent to learn biochemistry with Hermann. Moreover, less than 3 months after my arrival in Copenhagen, I was asked to propose plans for the following year. This was not a simple matter, as I had no plans. The only safe option was to ask for funds to spend another year with Hermann. It would have been risky to say that I could not make myself enjoy biochemistry. Furthermore, I could see no reason why they should not permit me to change my plans after the second year was approved. So I wrote to Washington saying that I wished to remain in Copenhagen. As expected, the money was made available for a second year of study. I wondered whether Hermann minded the fact that I was seldom around. He appeared very unclear about most things, and might not yet have really noticed. Fortunately, however, these fears never had time to develop seriously. Through a completely unexpected event, I found I could stop feeling guilty. One day, early in December, I cycled over to Hermann's laboratory expecting another charming conversation which was impossible to understand. This time, however, I found that things were different. Hermann had something important to say. His marriage was over, and he hoped to obtain a divorce. This fact was soon no secret. Everyone else in the laboratory was also told. Within a few days, it became apparent that Hermann's mind was not going to concentrate on science for some time, for perhaps as long as I would remain in Copenhagen. So the fact that he did not have to teach me nucleic acid biochemistry was obviously a piece of good luck. I could cycle over to Ole's laboratory, knowing it was clearly better to deceive Washington about where I was working than to force Hermann to talk about biochemistry. At times, moreover, I was quite pleased with my experiments on bacterial viruses. Within 3 months, Ole and I had collected enough data for a respectable publication, and, using ordinary standards, I knew I could stop work for the rest of the year without being judged unproductive. On the other hand, it was equally obvious that I had not done anything which was going to tell us what a gene was, or how it could copy itself. And unless I became a chemist, I could not see how I would. So I welcomed Hermann's suggestion that I should go that spring to an animal study centre in Naples, where he had decided to spend the months of April and May. A trip to Naples made great sense. There was no point in doing nothing in Copenhagen, where spring does not exist. On the other hand, the sun of Naples might encourage me to learn something about the biochemistry of the early development of marine animals. It might also be a place where I could quietly read genetics, and when I was tired of it, I might even pick up a book on biochemistry. Without any hesitation, I wrote to the States, requesting permission to accompany Hermann to Naples. A cheerful letter wishing me a pleasant journey came by return post from Washington. Moreover, it enclosed a $200 check for travel expenses. It made me feel slightly dishonest as I set off for the sun. Maurice Wilkins had also not come to Naples for serious science. The trip from London was an unexpected gift from his boss, J.T. Randall. Originally, Randall had planned to come to the meeting on large molecules and read a paper about the work going on in his new biophysics laboratory. Finding himself too busy, he decided to send Maurice instead. If no one went, it would look bad for his King's College laboratory. Lots of scarce British government money had been spent to set this up, and suspicions existed that this was money wasted. By the time Maurice arrived, I was noticeably restless and impatient to return north. Hermann had completely deceived me. For the first 6 weeks in Naples, I was constantly cold. The official temperature is often much less relevant than the absence of central heating. Neither the Animal Study Centre nor my room, on the top floor of a 6-story 19th-century house, had any heat. If I had had even the slightest interest in marine animals, I would have done experiments. Moving about doing experiments is much warmer than sitting in the library with one's feet on the table. At times, I stood about nervously while Hermann did some biochemistry, and on several days I even understood what he said. It made no difference, however, whether or not I followed the argument. Genes were never at the centre or even at the edge of his thoughts. Most of my time I spent walking the streets or reading journal articles from the early days of genetics. Sometimes I daydreamed about discovering the secret of the gene, but not once did I have the faintest trace of a respectable idea. It was therefore difficult to avoid the disturbing thought that I was not achieving anything. Knowing that I had not come to Naples for work did not make me feel better. I still had a slight hope that I might profit from the meeting on the structures of large biological molecules. Though I knew nothing about the X-ray diffraction methods that dominated structural analysis, I was optimistic that the spoken arguments would be easier to understand than the journal articles. I was specially interested to hear the talk on nucleic acids which would be given by Randall. At that time, almost nothing was published about the possible shapes of a nucleic acid molecule, and perhaps this fact affected my relaxed attitude to learning chemistry. Why should I get excited about learning boring chemical facts if the chemists never provided any useful information about the nucleic acids? The chances, however, were against learning anything new then about the shapes of proteins and nucleic acids. Though this work had been going on for over 15 years, most, if not all, of the facts were untested. Ideas put forward with conviction were likely to be the products of wild crystallographers who were delighted to be in a field where their ideas could not easily be disproved. Because of this, although almost all biochemists, including Hermann, were unable to understand the arguments of the X-ray people, there was little anxiety. It made no sense to learn complicated mathematical methods in order to understand nonsense. As a result, none of my teachers ever considered the possibility that I might work with an X-ray crystallographer. Morris, however, did not disappoint me. The fact that he was there in place of Randall made no difference. I had not known about either of them. His talk stood out sharply from the rest, several of which had no connection to the purpose of the meeting. In contrast, Morris's X-ray diffraction picture of DNA was relevant. It was shown on the screen towards the end of his talk. Morris's English voice showed little emotion as he stated that the picture showed much more detail than previous pictures and could in fact be considered as that of a crystalline structure. And when the structure of DNA was known, we might be in a better position to understand how genes work. Suddenly, I was excited about chemistry. Before Morris's talk, I had worried about the possibility that the gene might be completely irregular. Now, however, I knew that genes could crystallize. Therefore, they must have a regular structure that could be solved in an uncomplicated way. Immediately, I began to wonder whether it might be possible for me to join Wilkins in working on DNA. After the lecture, I tried to find him. Perhaps he already knew more than his talk had indicated. Often, if a scientist is not absolutely sure he is correct, he hesitates to speak in public. But there was no opportunity to speak to him. Morris had disappeared. Not till the next day, when everybody took a trip to the Greek ruins at Paestum, did I get an opportunity to introduce myself. While waiting for the bus, I started a conversation and explained how interested I was in DNA. But before I could ask any questions, the bus arrived, and I sat beside my sister, Elizabeth, who had just come in from the States. At the ruins we scattered, and before I could find Morris again, I realized that I might have had a great piece of good luck. Morris had noticed that my sister was very pretty, and soon they were eating lunch together. I was very pleased. If Morris really liked my sister, it was inevitable that I would become involved with his X-ray work on DNA. The fact that he went to sit alone when I arrived did not upset me. He obviously had good manners and assumed that I wished to talk to Elizabeth. As soon as we reached Naples, however, my daydreams ended. Morris moved off to his hotel with only a nod of his head. Neither the beauty of my sister nor my interest in DNA had captured him. Our futures did not seem to be in London. And so I set off to Copenhagen again, with only the thought of more biochemistry to avoid. I forgot about Morris, but not his DNA photograph. This might be a key to the secret of life, and it was impossible to push it out of my mind. The fact that I was unable to understand it did not bother me. It was certainly better to imagine myself becoming famous than growing into a quiet university teacher who had never risked the thought. I was also encouraged by the very exciting rumour that Linus Pauling had partly solved the structure of proteins. The news hit me in Geneva, where I had stopped for several days to talk with the Swiss virologist Jean Weigel, who was just back from a winter at Caltech. Before leaving, Jean had gone to a lecture where Linus had made the announcement. Pauling had talked as if he had been in show business all his life. A curtain kept his model hidden until near the end of his lecture, when he proudly showed off his latest creation. Then, with his eyes shining, Linus explained exactly what made his model, the Alpha Helix, uniquely beautiful. This show, like all of his performances, delighted the younger students there. Several of the scientists, however, watched with mixed feelings. Seeing Linus jumping up and down and moving his arms like a magician, who would soon pull a rabbit out of his shoe, made them feel inadequate. If only he had been a little more humble, it would have been so much easier to accept. A number of his colleagues waited quietly for the day when he would fall flat on his face by making a big mistake about something important. But Jean could not tell me whether Linus's Alpha Helix was right. He was not an X-ray crystallographer and could not judge the model professionally. Several of his younger friends, however, trained in structural chemistry, thought the Alpha Helix looked very pretty. Their best guess was that Linus was correct. If so, this was one more highly significant achievement. Linus would be the first person to propose something solidly correct about the structure of a biologically important large molecule. Possibly, he might also have discovered a sensational new method which could be extended to the nucleic acids. By the time I was back in Copenhagen, a journal containing an article by Linus on the Alpha Helix had arrived from the States. I quickly read it and immediately reread it. Most of the language was above me, and I could only get a general idea of his argument. I had no way of judging whether it made sense. The only thing I was sure of was that it was written with style. So I began worrying about where I could learn to understand X-ray diffraction pictures. Caltech was not the place. Linus was too great a man to waste his time teaching a biologist with limited mathematics. Neither did I wish to be ignored again by Wilkins. This left Cambridge, England, where I knew that someone named Max Perutz was interested in the structure of the large biological molecules. So I wrote to Luria about my new interest, asking whether he knew how to arrange my acceptance into the Cambridge laboratory. Unexpectedly, this was no problem at all. Soon after receiving my letter, Luria went to a small meeting at Ann Arbor, where he met Perutz's colleague, John Kendrew, then on an extended trip to the States. Most fortunately, Luria liked Kendrew. He was as civilized as Calca, and in addition supported the Labour Party. Furthermore, the Cambridge laboratory was understaffed, and Kendrew was looking for someone to join him in his study of the proteins. Luria assured him I would be suitable, and immediately wrote to tell me the good news. It was then early August, just a month before my original funding from the States would end. This meant that I could not delay writing to Washington about my change of plans for much longer. I decided to wait until I was admitted officially into the Cambridge laboratory. There was always the possibility that something would go wrong. Also, I did not want to be away during an approaching international conference which would bring several bacterial virus workers to Copenhagen. Max Delbruck was in the expected group, and since he was in a senior position at Caltech, he might have further news about Pauling's latest trick. Delbruck, however, could tell me nothing more. The Alpha Helix, even if correct, had not provided any new biological knowledge. He seemed quite bored speaking about it, but I had no opportunity to be depressed by his lack of enthusiasm, because the conference was a huge success. From the moment the several hundred scientists arrived, a great amount of free drink, partly provided by American dollars, was available to improve international relations. Each night there were parties, dinners, and midnight trips to waterside bars. An important truth was slowly entering my head. A scientist's life might be interesting socially as well as intellectually. I went off to England in a very good mood. Chapter 3. Making a Start. Max Perutz was in his office when I came in just after lunch. John Kendrew was still in the States, but my arrival was not unexpected. A brief letter from John said that an American biologist might work with him during the following year. I explained that I had no knowledge of how X-rays diffract, but Max immediately made me feel comfortable. I was told that no advanced mathematics would be required. All I had to do was read a book on crystallography. This would give me enough theory to begin to take X-ray photographs. As an example, Max told me about how he had tested Pauling's alpha helix. Only a day had been required to get the important photograph confirming Pauling's prediction. I did not understand what Max was saying at all. I did not even know about Bragg's law, the most basic of all crystallographic ideas. We then went for a walk to look at possible accommodation for the coming year. When Max realized that I had come directly to the laboratory from the station and had not yet seen any of the colleges, he changed direction to take me through King's and along the side of the river to Trinity College. I had never seen such beautiful buildings in all my life, and any hesitation I might have had about my safe life as a biologist disappeared. Because of this, I was only slightly depressed when I looked inside several houses which contained student rooms. In the end, I thought myself very lucky when I found a room in a 2-story house on Jesus Green, less than 10 minutes' walk from the laboratory. The following morning I went back to the Cavendish, since Max wanted me to meet Sir Lawrence Bragg. Bragg came down from his office, let me say a few words, and then went off for a private conversation with Max. A few minutes later they came out to allow Bragg to give me his formal permission to work under his direction. The performance was typically British, and I quietly decided that the white-moustached figure of Bragg now spent most of his days sitting in London clubs. The thought never occurred to me then that later on I would have contact with this strange figure from the past. Despite his great reputation, Bragg had worked out his law before the First World War, so I assumed he must be more or less retired and would never care about genes. I politely thanked Sir Lawrence for accepting me and told Max I would be back in 3 weeks for the start of term. I then returned to Copenhagen to collect a few clothes and to tell Hermann about my good luck in being able to become a crystallographer. Hermann sent a letter to Washington, in which he enthusiastically approved of my change of plans. At the same time, I wrote a letter myself, saying that I wanted to give up standard biochemistry, which I believed was incapable of telling us how genes work. Instead, I told them that I now knew that X-ray crystallography was the key to genetics, and asked for approval of my plans to transfer to Perutz's laboratory in Cambridge. I saw no reason to remain in Copenhagen until permission came. The week before, Marlowe had departed for a year at Caltech, and I still had no interest in Hermann's type of biochemistry. Also, everyone knew of Hermann's unhappy state and his absence from the laboratory, and the Washington office must have been wondering how long I would want to remain there. In spite of all this, 10 days after my return to Cambridge, Hermann forwarded bad news, which had been sent to my Copenhagen address. In it, the Washington board told me to reconsider my plans, since I was unqualified to do any crystallographic work. The source of the trouble was quite obvious. The head of the board was no longer Hans Clark, a biochemist friend of Hermann's, then planning to retire from Columbia. My letter had gone instead to a new chairman, who took a more active interest in directing young people. He was offended that I had said I would not profit from biochemistry. I wrote to Luria to save me. He and the new man knew each other a little, and more details from him might lead to a change of mind. At first I was cheered up when a letter arrived from Luria saying that the situation might be improved if we appeared very humble and apologetic. I should write to Washington, saying that a major reason why I wanted to be in Cambridge was the presence of Roy Markham, an English biochemist who worked with plant viruses. Markham was quite relaxed when I told him he might acquire a good student who would never bother him by doing experiments in his laboratory. He saw the plan as a perfect example of the inability of Americans to know how to behave. However, he agreed to it. Knowing that Markham would not give me away, I wrote a long letter to Washington, describing how I might profit from working with both Perutz and Markham. At the end, I told them honestly that I was in Cambridge and would remain there until a decision was made. The new man in Washington, however, did not cooperate. The clue came when the return letter was addressed to Hermann's laboratory. The board was considering my case. I would be informed when a decision had been made. Because of this, it did not seem sensible to cash my cheques, which were still sent to Copenhagen each month. Fortunately, the possibility of not being paid in the following year for working on DNA was only annoying and not fatal. The $3,000 that I had received for being in Copenhagen was 3 times the amount that a Danish student required to live well. Even if I had to pay for my sister's recent purchase of 2 fashionable Paris suits, I would have $1,000 left, enough for a year's stay in Cambridge. My landlady was also helpful. She threw me out after less than a month. My main crime was not removing my shoes when I entered the house after 9 o'clock, the hour at which her husband went to sleep. Even worse, I sometimes went out after 10 o'clock. Nothing in Cambridge was open at that time, and my motives were seen as suspicious. John and Elizabeth Kendrew rescued me with the offer, at almost no rent, of a tiny room in their house. It was unbelievably damp and heated only by an ancient electric fire, but I eagerly accepted. Though it looked like an open invitation to serious illness, living with friends was greatly preferable to any other accommodation I might find at this late date. From my first day in the laboratory, I knew that I would not leave Cambridge for a long time. Departing would be silly, because I had immediately discovered the fun of talking to Francis Crick. Finding someone in Max's laboratory who knew that DNA was more important than proteins was real luck. Moreover, it was a great relief for me not to spend all my time learning X-ray analysis of proteins. Our lunch conversations quickly centered on how genes were put together. Within a few days after my arrival, we knew what to do. Imitate Linus Pauling and beat him at his own game. Pauling's success had naturally suggested to Francis that the same tricks might also work for DNA. As long as nobody in Cambridge thought DNA was very important, the possible personal difficulties with the King's laboratory had prevented him from working on it. But now, with me around the laboratory, always wanting to talk about genes, Francis began to think about DNA more often. Because of this, John Kendrew soon realized that I was unlikely to help him with his work on protein structure. Since he was unable to grow large protein crystals, he had hoped that I might be able to help. However, my laboratory work was not very good, and my attempts at crystallization were no more successful than John's. In a way, I was almost relieved. If I had succeeded, he might have told me to take X-ray photographs. So, nothing prevented me from talking at least several hours each day to Francis. Thinking all the time was too much even for Francis, and often when he was puzzled by his calculations, he would ask me to tell him about bacterial viruses. At other moments, Francis would try to fill my brain with crystallographic facts. The only other way to learn these would be through slow and painful reading of professional journals. Particularly important were the exact arguments needed to understand how Linus Pauling had discovered the alpha helix. I was soon taught that Pauling's achievement was a product of common sense, not the result of complicated mathematics. Calculations sometimes came into his arguments, but in most cases, words would have been enough. The key to Linus's success was that he relied on the simple laws of structural chemistry. The alpha helix had not been found by only staring at X-ray pictures. The essential trick, instead, was to ask which atoms liked to sit next to each other. In place of pencil and paper, the main working tools were a set of molecular models, which looked a little like the toys of very young children. We could therefore see no reason why we should not solve DNA in the same way. All we had to do was to construct a set of molecular models and begin to play. With luck, the structure would be a helix. Any other type of arrangement would be much more complicated. From our first conversations, we assumed that the DNA molecule contained a very large number of nucleotides linked together in a regular chain. Again, our ideas were partly based on simplicity. Although organic chemists in Alexander Todd's nearby laboratory thought that this was the basic arrangement, they were still a long way from proving that all the bonds between the nucleotides were the same. If this was not the case, however, we could not see how the DNA molecules came together to form the crystalline material studied by Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin. So, for the moment, the best way forward was to regard the sugar-phosphate backbone as extremely regular, and to search for a helical arrangement in which all the backbone groups had the same chemical environment. Immediately we could see that the solution to DNA would be more tricky than that of the alpha helix. In this, a single chain folds up into a helical arrangement held together by hydrogen bonds between groups on the same chain. Maurice had told Francis, however, that the DNA molecule was thicker than one nucleotide chain. This made him think that the DNA molecule was a complex helix made up of several nucleotide chains twisted around each other. If this was true, then before serious model building began, we would have to decide whether the chains would be held together by hydrogen bonds or by salt bridges, involving the negatively charged phosphate groups. A further complication was that 4 types of nucleotides were found in DNA. In this sense, DNA was not a regular molecule, but an extremely irregular one. The 4 nucleotides were not, however, completely different, because each contained the same sugar and phosphate parts. Their uniqueness lay in their bases, which were either a purine, of type A or G, or a pyrimidine, type C or T. But since the links between the nucleotides only involved the sugar and phosphate groups, our assumption that the same kind of chemical bond linked all the nucleotides together was not affected. So, in building models, we would accept that the sugar-phosphate backbone was very regular, and the order of the bases must be very irregular. If the order of the bases was always the same, all DNA molecules would be the same, and there would not be the variety that makes one gene different from another. Though Pauling had found the alpha helix almost without using X-ray data, he knew about it and had included it in his thinking. Because of the X-ray data, a large number of possible arrangements for his chain of structures were quickly excluded. The exact X-ray data should help us go ahead much faster with the complex construction of the DNA molecule. Just looking at the DNA X-ray picture should prevent a number of false starts. Fortunately, one half-good photograph had already been published. It had been taken 5 years previously by the English crystallographer W.T. Astbury, and could be used to start us off. But having Maurice's much better crystalline photographs might save us from 6 months to a year's work. We knew we had to talk to him. To our surprise, Francis had no problem in persuading Maurice to come up to Cambridge for a weekend, and there was no need to force Maurice to the conclusion that the structure was a helix. Not only was it the obvious guess, but Maurice had already been talking about helices at a summer meeting in Cambridge. About 6 weeks before I arrived there, he had shown X-ray diffraction pictures of DNA and suggested that it had a helical shape made up of 3 nucleotide chains. He did not, however, share our belief that Pauling's model-building game would quickly solve the structure, at least not until further X-ray results were obtained. Most of our conversation, instead, was about Rosie. More trouble than ever was coming from her. She was now insisting that not even Maurice himself should take any more X-ray photographs of DNA. In trying to reach agreement with Rosie, Maurice had made a very bad bargain. He had handed over to her all the good crystalline DNA used in his original work, and had agreed to limit his studies to other DNA, which he afterwards found did not crystallize. The point had been reached where Rosie would not even tell Maurice her latest results. The soonest Maurice was likely to learn what progress she had made was 3 weeks ahead, the middle of November. At that time, Rosie was due to give a talk on her past 6 months' work. Naturally, I was delighted when Maurice said I would be welcome at this talk. For the first time, I had a real reason to learn some crystallography. I wanted to understand what Rosie said. Chapter 4. The Cochrane-Crick Theory. Most unexpectedly, Francis temporarily lost all interest in DNA less than a week later. The reason was his decision to accuse a colleague of ignoring his ideas. It happened less than a month after my arrival, on a Saturday morning. The previous day, Max Perutz had given Francis a new article written by Sir Lawrence, and himself, dealing with the shape of a protein molecule. As he quickly read through it, Francis became very angry, because he noticed that part of the argument depended upon an idea he had suggested 9 months earlier. What was worse, Francis remembered telling it to everyone in the laboratory. But his idea had not been mentioned in the article. Almost at once, after rushing in to tell Max and John Kendrew about this insult, he hurried to Bragg's office for an explanation, if not an apology. But by then Bragg was at home, and Francis had to wait until the following morning. Unfortunately, this delay did not make the meeting any more successful. Sir Lawrence denied having known anything about Francis's efforts, and was extremely insulted by the suggestion that he had secretly used another scientist's ideas. On the other hand, Francis found it impossible to believe that Bragg could have been stupid enough to have missed his idea, which he had talked about many times, and he suggested this very strongly. More conversation became impossible, and in less than 10 minutes, Francis was out of Bragg's office. For Bragg, this meeting seemed the end of any good relations with Crick. Several weeks earlier, Bragg had come into the laboratory greatly excited about an idea that he had had the previous evening, one that he and Perutz later included in their article. While he was explaining it to Perutz and Kendrew, Crick joined the group. To his great annoyance, Francis did not accept the idea immediately, but instead said that he would go away and check whether Bragg was right or wrong. At that point, Bragg had become very angry. This most recent argument was a disaster for Francis, and he looked worried when he came down to the laboratory. Bragg, when he sent him out of his room, had angrily told him that he would consider seriously whether he could continue to give Francis a place in the laboratory after his PhD course was ended. Francis was obviously worried that he might have to find a new position. His worry was not without a good reason. Although he knew that he was clever and could produce new ideas, he could claim no obvious intellectual achievements, and he was still without his PhD. He came from a solid middle-class family, studied physics at University College London, and had started work on an advanced degree when the war began. Like almost all other English scientists, he joined the war effort and became part of the Navy's scientific team. He worked with great energy, and although many disliked his non-stop conversation, there was a war to win, and he was quite helpful in producing new weapons. When the war was over, however, some of his colleagues saw no good reason to have him around forever, and he learned that he had no future in the government scientific service. Moreover, he had lost all desire to stay in physics, and decided instead to try biology. He managed to get a small amount of money to come to Cambridge in the autumn of 1947. At first, he did pure biology, but 2 years later, he moved over to the Cavendish. Here, he again became excited about science and decided that he should finally work for a PhD. So he became a student of Caius College, studying under Max. In a way, PhD work was boring for a mind that worked so fast, but his decision had produced an unexpected advantage. In this difficult time, he would not be sent away before he got his degree. Max and John came quickly to Francis's rescue and spoke to Bragg. John confirmed that Francis had previously written about this argument, and Bragg accepted that the same idea had come independently to both of them. Bragg by that time had calmed down, and the idea of Crick going was quietly dropped. Keeping him was not easy for Bragg. One day, in a moment of unhappiness, he revealed that Crick made his ears ring. Moreover, he still could not believe that Crick was needed. For 35 years, Crick had not stopped talking, but he had said almost nothing of real value. A new opportunity to think about theory soon brought Francis back to normal. Several days after the problem with Bragg, the crystallographer V. Vand sent Max a letter containing a theory for the diffraction of X-rays by helical molecules. Helices were then at the centre of the laboratory's interest, mainly because of Pauling's alpha helix. But there was still no general theory to test new models, as well as to confirm the details of the alpha helix. This is what Vand hoped his theory would do. Francis quickly found a serious fault in Vand's efforts, became excited about finding the right theory, and ran upstairs to talk with Bill Cochrane, a small, quiet Scot, then a lecturer in crystallography at the Cavendish. Bill was the cleverest of the younger Cambridge X-ray people, and the best person for Francis to discuss his many new theories with. When Bill told Francis that an idea would not work or would lead nowhere, Francis could be sure that professional jealousy was not involved. This time, however, Bill did not disagree with Francis because he had also found faults in Vand's paper and had begun to wonder what the right answer was. For months, both Max and Bragg had been asking him to work out the helical theory, but he had not moved into action. Now, with additional pressure from Francis, he too had begun seriously to think about the mathematics. For the rest of the morning, Francis was silent, because he was also thinking about mathematics. Then, at lunchtime, he got a bad headache and he went home. But sitting in front of his gas fire doing nothing bored him, and he started on the mathematics again. To his delight, he soon saw that he had the answer. However, he stopped his work because he and his wife, Odile, were invited to a wine tasting at Matthew's, one of the better Cambridge shops. For several days he had been looking forward to this. It meant acceptance by a more fashionable and amusing part of Cambridge, and allowed him to forget that he was not appreciated by a variety of dull and self-important university people. He and Odile were then living at the Green Door, a tiny, inexpensive flat on top of a several-hundred-year-old house just across Bridge Street from St. John's College. There were only 2 real rooms, a living room and a bedroom. All the others, including the kitchen, in which the bath was the largest and most visible object, were almost non-existent. But despite the small size, its great charm, increased by Odile's decorative sense, made it a cheerful and happy place. Here I first sensed the energy of English intellectual life, so completely absent during my first days in my room several hundred metres away. They had been married for 3 years. Francis's first marriage did not last long, and the son, Michael, was looked after by Francis's mother and aunt. He had lived alone for several years, until Odile, 5 years younger than him, came to Cambridge. She shared his dislike of the dullness of the middle classes, which enjoy healthy amusements like sailing and tennis, habits particularly unsuited to a conversational life. By then, I was often going to the Green Door for dinner. Francis was always eager to continue our conversations, while I joyously seized every opportunity to escape from the miserable English food that frequently made me wonder if I had a stomach problem. Odile's French mother had given her a strong dislike for the way in which most Englishmen eat and house themselves. Because of this, Francis never had reason to envy those lecturers whose college food was much better than their wives' boring mixtures of tasteless meat, boiled potatoes, colourless vegetables, and typical puddings. Instead, dinner was often happy, especially after the wine turned the conversation to the more attractive women of Cambridge. But there were no young women at the wine tasting. To his and Odile's disappointment, their companions were college lecturers, talking about the burden of paperwork which they had to cope with. They went home early, and Francis, who had drunk less than usual, thought more about his answer. The next morning he arrived at the laboratory and told Max and John about his success. A few minutes later Bill Cochrane walked into his office and Francis started to repeat the story. But then Bill told him that he also thought he had succeeded. Quickly, they each went through their mathematics and discovered that Bill's version was shorter and more elegant than Francis's. Happily, however, they found that they had arrived at the same final answer. They then checked the alpha helix by visual inspection with Max's X-ray diagrams. The agreement was so good that both Linus's model and the theory had to be correct. Within a few days, a finished article was ready and sent off to Nature. At the same time, a copy was sent to Pauling to appreciate. This event, his first unquestionable success, was a great thing for Francis. This time, the absence of women had been accompanied by luck. Chapter 5. Rosie's Results. By mid-November, the time of Rosie's talk on DNA, I had learned enough about crystallography to understand much of her lecture. Most importantly, I knew which parts to give my attention to. After 6 weeks of listening to Francis, I knew that what really mattered was whether Rosie's new X-ray pictures would give any support to a helical DNA structure. The really relevant experimental details were those which might provide clues in constructing molecular models. It took, however, only a few minutes of listening to Rosie to realize that her determined mind had decided on a different course of action. She spoke to an audience of about 15, in a quick, nervous style. There was not a trace of warmth or lightness in her words. Even so, I could not regard her as totally uninteresting. For a moment, I wondered how she would look if she took off her glasses and did something different with her hair. Then, however, my interest moved back to her description of the crystalline X-ray diffraction pattern. The years of careful, unemotional crystallographic training had left their mark. It was totally obvious to her that the only way to discover the DNA structure was by a pure crystallographic method. As model building did not appeal to her, at no time did she mention Pauling's success over the alpha helix. The idea of using toy-like models to solve biological structures was clearly last on her list of possible ways forward. Of course, Rosie knew of Linus's success, but she saw no obvious reason to copy his methods. The record of his past victories was enough of a reason to act differently. Only someone as brilliant as Linus could play like a 10-year-old boy and still get the right answer. Rosie regarded her talk as an initial report which by itself would not test anything basic about DNA. Hard facts would only come when further data had been collected which could allow the crystallographic analyses to move to a more advanced stage. The small group of laboratory people who came to the talk appeared no more optimistic. No one else spoke about the desirability of using molecular models to help solve the structure. Morris himself only asked several questions of a technical nature. The discussion then quickly stopped. Maybe the unwillingness of the others to say anything optimistic or even to mention models was due to fear of a sharp response from Rosie. Following some brief and typically tense conversation with Rosie, Morris and I walked to a Soho restaurant. Morris's mood was surprisingly cheerful. Slowly and exactly, he explained how, in spite of much complex crystallographic analysis, little real progress had been made by Rosie since the day she arrived at King's. Though her X-ray photographs were a little sharper than his, she was unable to say anything more positive than he had already. She had done some more detailed analysis of the amount of water in DNA, but even here Morris had doubts about whether she was really measuring what she claimed. To my surprise, Morris seemed happy to be in my company. The shyness that existed when we first met in Naples had disappeared. He seemed to appreciate the fact that I, one of the bacterial virus group, found what he was doing important. It really was no help to receive encouragement from another physicist. Even when he met those who thought his decision to go into biology made sense, he could not trust their judgment. After all, they did not know any biology, and so it was best to take their remarks as politeness towards someone opposed to the competitive speed of post-war physics. He did get active and very necessary help from some biochemists. If not, he could never have come into the game. Several of them had helped a great deal in providing him with some highly purified DNA. On the other hand, the majority were not like the ambitious types he had worked with on the atomic bomb project. Sometimes they did not even seem to know why DNA was important. So the knowledge that the bacterial virus group took DNA seriously made Morris hope that times would change, and he would not have to explain each time he gave a talk why his laboratory was making so much noise about DNA. By the time our dinner was finished, he was clearly in a mood to push ahead. But then Rosie came back into the conversation, and the possibility of really getting the laboratory moving forward grew less and less as we paid the bill and went out into the night. The following morning I joined Francis at Paddington Station. From there, we were going up to Oxford to spend the weekend. Francis wanted to talk to Dorothy Hodgkin, the best of the English crystallographers, while I welcomed the opportunity to see Oxford for the first time. At the station, Francis seemed very happy. The visit would give him the chance to tell Dorothy about his success with Bill Cochrane in working out the helical diffraction theory. The theory was much too elegant not to be told in person. Those like Dorothy who were clever enough to understand its power immediately were much too rare. As soon as we were in the train carriage, Francis began asking questions about Rosie's talk. My answers were frequently unclear, and Francis was visibly annoyed by my habit of always trusting to memory and never writing anything on paper. If a subject interested me, I could usually remember what I needed. This time, however, we were in trouble, because I did not know enough of the crystallographic vocabulary. Particularly unfortunate was my failure to be able to report exactly the amount of water in the DNA upon which Rosie had done her measurements. It was possible that I might be deceiving Francis by a difference of 10 times the figures she gave. The wrong person had been sent to hear Rosie. If Francis had gone along, he would have written everything down. It was the penalty for being oversensitive to the situation. Certainly, the sight of Francis thinking about the consequences of Rosie's information when it was hardly out of her mouth would have upset Morris. In one way, it would be highly unfair for them to learn the facts at the same time. Certainly, Morris should have the first chance to work on the problem. On the other hand, there seemed no indication that he thought the answer would come from playing with molecular models. Our conversation the previous night had hardly mentioned that approach. Of course, the possibility existed that he was keeping something back, but that was very unlikely. Morris just was not that type. The only thing Francis could do immediately was to seize the water value, which was easiest to think about. Soon, something appeared to make sense, and he began to write on the blank back sheet of an article he had been reading. By then, I could not understand what Francis was doing, and opened the Times for amusement. Within a few minutes, however, Francis made me lose all interest in the outside world by telling me that only a small number of structures were possible according to both the Cochrane-Crick theory and Rosie's experimental data. Quickly, he began to draw more diagrams to show me how simple the problem was. Though the mathematics was too difficult for me, the important part was not difficult to understand. Decisions had to be made about the number of nucleotide chains within the DNA molecule. The X-ray data, as we understood it, would allow for 2, 3, or 4 chains. It was all a question of the angle of twist and the distance apart of the chains. By the time the hour-and-a-half train journey was over, Francis saw no reason why we should not know the answer soon. Perhaps a week of playing with the molecular models would be necessary to make us absolutely sure we had the right answer. Then it would be obvious to the world that Pauling was not the only one capable of really understanding how biological molecules were constructed. Linus's capture of the alpha helix was most embarrassing for the Cambridge group. About a year before that success, Bragg, Kendrew and Perutz had published a paper on the structure of the chains that Linus was working with. It showed a misunderstanding of the situation, and Bragg was still bothered by that failure. There had been previous struggles with Linus, stretching back over a 25-year period. Most times, Linus had got there first. Even Francis was a little embarrassed by the event. He had been present at a discussion in which the basic mistake about the shape of the bonds in the chain had been made. That had certainly been the right occasion to use his ability to assess the meaning of experimental observations, but he had said nothing useful. Francis did not normally hold back from criticizing his friends. In other situations, he had been annoyingly honest in pointing out where Perutz and Bragg had publicly misread their results. This open criticism was certainly behind Sir Lawrence's recent anger with him. In Bragg's view, all Crick did was to upset people. Now, however, was not the time to concentrate on past mistakes. Instead, the speed with which we talked about possible types of DNA structures increased as the morning went by. Whenever we found ourselves with a new companion, Francis would quickly look back over the progress of the past few hours, bringing our listener up to date on how we had decided on models in which the sugar phosphate backbone was in the center of the molecule. Only in that way would it be possible to obtain a structure regular enough to give the crystalline diffraction patterns observed by Morris and Rosie. We still had to deal with the irregular order of the bases that faced the outside, but this difficulty might disappear when the correct internal arrangement was found. There was also the problem of what neutralized the negative charge of the phosphate groups of the DNA backbone. Francis, as well as I, knew almost nothing about how inorganic ions were arranged in actual space. We had to face the difficult situation that the world authority on the structural chemistry of ions was Linus Pauling himself. Because of this, if the main part of the problem was to work out a clever arrangement of inorganic ions and phosphate groups, we were clearly at a disadvantage. By midday, it became very important to find a copy of Linus's book on the subject. We were having lunch, but wasting no time over coffee, we ran into several bookshops until success came in Blackwell's. We quickly read the relevant sections. This produced the correct values for the exact sizes of the important inorganic ions, but nothing that could really help to solve the problem. When we reached Dorothy's laboratory in the University Museum, we had slowed down a little. Francis talked through the helical theory itself, giving only a few minutes to our progress with DNA. Most of the conversation was about Dorothy's recent work in other areas. Since darkness was coming, there seemed no point in wasting more of her time. We then moved on to Magdalen College, where we had tea with Avrion Mitchison and Leslie Orgel. Over cakes, Francis was ready to talk about small things, while I quietly thought how splendid it would be if I could someday live in the style of a Magdalen lecturer.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
Chapter 6. First Attempt. I told John and Elizabeth Kendrew the news about our progress with DNA when I joined them for breakfast on Monday morning. Elizabeth appeared delighted that success was almost within our reach, while John took the news more calmly. When he realized that I had nothing more solid to report than enthusiasm, his attention turned to the Times. Soon afterwards, John went off to his rooms at Peterhouse College, leaving Elizabeth and me to think about my unexpected luck. I did not remain long, since the sooner I could get back to the laboratory, the quicker we could find out which of the several possible answers would be suggested by a hard look at the molecular models themselves. Both Francis and I, however, knew that the models in the Cavendish would not be completely satisfactory. They had been put together by John about 18 months before, for the work on the shape of the chain that Linus had solved. There existed no accurate representation of the groups of atoms unique to DNA. Neither phosphorus atoms nor the purine and pyrimidine bases were available. We would have to make these ourselves. Having completely new models made might take a week, while an answer was possible within a day or two. So, as soon as I got to the laboratory, I started adding bits of wire to some of our carbon atom models, in this way changing them into the larger-sized phosphorus atoms. Much more difficulty came from the need to build models of the inorganic ions. Unlike the other parts, they obeyed no simple rules telling us the angles at which they would form their chemical bonds. Most likely, we had to know the correct DNA structure before the right models could be made. I maintained the hope, however, that Francis might already have worked out an answer. Over 18 hours had passed since our last conversation, and there was little chance that he would have been interested in the Sunday papers after his return to the Green Door. His entrance at about 10 o'clock, however, did not bring the answer. After Sunday supper, he had again thought about the problem but saw no quick answer. But over morning coffee, he seemed confident that enough experimental data might already be available to determine the correct way forward. We might be able to start the game with several completely different sets of facts and still always hit the final answers. Perhaps the whole problem would solve itself by concentrating on the prettiest way for a nucleotide chain to fold up. So while Francis continued thinking about the meaning of the X-ray diagram, I began to put the various atomic models into several chains, each several nucleotides in length. Though in nature DNA chains are very long, there was no reason to put together anything massive. If we could be sure it was a helix, the assignment of the positions for only a couple of nucleotides automatically determined the arrangement of all the other parts. The routine assembly task was over by 1, when Francis and I walked over to a nearby pub for our habitual lunch with the chemist Herbert Gutfreund. When we walked in, Francis did not exchange his usual noisy greetings with the Persian economist Ephraim Eshag, but instead gave the impression that something serious was on his mind. The actual model building would start right after lunch, and more definite plans must be made to make the process more efficient. So, over our fruit pie, we considered the advantages and disadvantages of 1, 2, 3, and 4 chains, quickly dismissing one chain helices as being against the evidence that we had. The best guess for forces that held the chains together seemed to be salt bridges holding together 2 or more phosphate groups. There was no evidence for this in the results that Rosie had obtained, so we might be taking a chance. On the other hand, there was no reason to believe we might not be right. If only the King's group had thought about models, they would have asked which salt was present, and we would not have been placed in this annoying position. Our first minutes with the models, though, were not joyous. Although only about 15 atoms were involved, they kept falling out of the awkward connectors set up to hold them the correct distance from one another. Even worse, we began to get the uncomfortable impression that there were no obvious limits to the bond angles between several of the most important atoms. This was not at all nice. Pauling had worked out the alpha helix from his knowledge that the bond he was dealing with was flat. To our annoyance, there seemed every reason to believe that the bonds which held together the neighbouring nucleotides of DNA might exist in a variety of shapes. At least, with our level of chemical knowledge, there was unlikely to be any single structure much prettier than the rest. After tea, however, a shape began to appear which raised our spirits. 3 chains twisted around each other in a way that gave rise to a regular crystallographic repeat every 2800 millionths of a centimetre. This was a feature demanded by Morris's and Rosie's pictures, so Francis seemed more confident when he stepped back from the laboratory table and surveyed the afternoon's effort. It was true that a few of the atomic contacts were still too close, but the delicate work had just begun. After a few more hours, a presentable model should be on display. We were both cheerful during the evening meal at the Green Door. Though Odile could not understand what we were saying, she was obviously happy that Francis was going to have his second success within the month. If events continued in this way, they would soon be rich and could own a car. At no moment did Francis see any reason to simplify the matter for Odil's benefit. This part of their relationship was fixed. She did not know any science and seemed uninterested in learning any. Our conversation instead centred on a young art student who was going to marry Odil's friend, Harmut Weil. This capture was mildly displeasing to Francis. It would remove the prettiest girl from their party group. There was no thought of women, however, when Francis marched into the laboratory just before morning coffee. Soon, when several atoms had been pushed in or out, the three-chain model began to look quite reasonable. The next obvious step would be to check it with Rosie's measurements. The model would certainly fit with the general positions of the X-ray reflections, because its essential helical shape had been chosen to fit the facts from Rosie's talk that I had passed on to Francis. If it were right, however, the model would also accurately predict the strengths of the various X-ray reflections in relation to each other. A quick phone call was made to Morris. Francis explained how the helical diffraction theory allowed a rapid assessment of possible DNA models, and that he and I had thought of one which might be the answer we were all waiting for. The best thing would be for Morris to come and look at it. But Morris gave no definite date, saying he thought he might manage sometime within the week. Soon after the phone was put down, John came in to see how Morris had taken our news. Francis found it hard to form his reply. It was almost as if Morris did not care about what we were doing. In the middle of further work on the model that afternoon, a call came through from King's. Morris would come up on the 10:10 train from London the following morning. Moreover, he would not be alone. His colleague Willie Seeds would also come. Even more interesting was that Rosie and her student, R.G. Gosling, would be on the same train. Apparently they were still interested in the answer. Morris decided to take a taxi from the station to the laboratory. Normally he would have come by bus, but there would be no satisfaction in waiting at the bus stop with Rosie. His attempts to have a conversation with her were all failures. And even now, when the possibility of being proved wrong hung over them, Rosie still ignored him and directed all her attention to Gosling. Only the slightest effort at a united appearance was made when Morris put his head into our laboratory to say they had come. Francis and I had earlier agreed to reveal our progress in 2 stages. Francis would first summarize the advantages of the helical theory. Then, together, we would explain how we had arrived at the proposed model for DNA. Afterwards, we could go to the Eagle for lunch, leaving the afternoon free to discuss how we would proceed with the final phases of the problem. The first part of the show went according to plan. Francis saw no reason to be cautious about describing the power of the helical theory, and within several minutes revealed how it gave neat answers. None of the visitors, however, showed any sign of sharing Francis's delight. Instead of wishing to do something with the theory, Morris wanted to concentrate on the fact that it did not go beyond some mathematics that his colleague Stokes had worked out without all this display. Stokes had solved the problem in the train while going home one evening and had produced the theory on a small sheet of paper the next morning. Rosie did not care at all about who first created the helical theory, and as Francis talked on, she displayed growing impatience. The lesson was unnecessary, since to her mind there was no evidence that DNA was helical. Whether this was correct would come out of further X-ray work. Inspection of the model itself only increased her opposition. She even became aggressive when we reached the topic of the positive ions which held together the phosphate groups of our 3-chain model. This feature had no appeal at all to Rosie, who coldly pointed out that the ions would be surrounded by tight shells of water molecules, and so were unlikely to be the key parts of a tight structure. Most annoyingly, her objections did not just come from her attempts to be difficult. At this stage, the embarrassing fact came out that my memory of the amount of water in the DNA Rosie worked with could not be right. The awkward truth became clear that the correct DNA model must contain at least 10 times more water than was found in our model. This did not mean that we were definitely wrong. With luck, we might be able to place the water in vacant areas on the edge of our helix. On the other hand, we could not escape the conclusion that our argument was weak. As soon as we accepted that much more water might be involved, the number of possible DNA models increased alarmingly. Though Francis could not help dominating the lunchtime conversation, his mood was no longer confident. It was clear to all which group had won the argument. The best way to rescue something from the day was to come to an agreement about the next set of experiments. In particular, only a few weeks' work should be necessary to see whether the DNA structure depended on the exact ions used to neutralize the negative phosphate groups. With this achieved, another period of model building could start, perhaps before Christmas. Our after-lunch walk into King's and along the riverside to Trinity did not, however, reveal any movement towards our point of view. Rosie and Gosling were still in a fighting mood. Their future course of action would not be affected by their 80-kilometre journey into youthful nonsense. Morris and Willie Seeds gave more indication of being reasonable, but there was no certainty that this was not simply because they did not want to agree with Rosie. The situation did not improve when we got back to the laboratory. Francis did not want to surrender immediately, so he talked through some of the actual details of how we had done the model building. However, he quickly lost his enthusiasm when it became apparent that I was the only one joining the conversation. Moreover, by this time neither of us really wanted to look at our model. All its charm had disappeared, and the homemade phosphorus atoms gave no indication that they would ever fit neatly into something of value. Then, when Morris mentioned that if they moved quickly they might catch the 3:40 train to Liverpool Street Station, we quickly said goodbye. Bragg soon learned of Rosie's great victory. We could only appear untroubled as the news confirmed the fact that Francis might move faster if occasionally he would close his mouth. The consequences spread in a predictable way. Clearly, this was the moment for Morris's boss to discuss with Bragg whether it made sense for Crick and the American to do the same kind of work as King's was putting so much effort into. Sir Lawrence had had too much of Francis to be surprised that he had again caused unnecessary trouble. There was no way of knowing where Francis would set off the next explosion. If he continued to behave this way, he could easily spend 5 years in the laboratory without collecting enough data to deserve an honest PhD. The frightening thought of having to put up with Francis during his remaining years in charge of the Cavendish was too much to ask of Bragg or anyone with a normal set of nerves. The decision was therefore passed on to Max that Francis and I must give up DNA. Bragg had no fears that this would hold back science, since inquiries to Max and John had revealed nothing original in our approach. After Pauling's success, no one could be blamed for believing in helices. Letting the King's group have the first attempt at helical models was the right thing in any situation. Crick could then get on with his PhD task of investigating the way that certain protein crystals shrink when they're placed in salt solutions of different strengths. A year to 18 months of steady work might tell something more solid about the shape of various protein molecules. With a PhD in his pocket, Crick could then seek employment elsewhere. No attempt was made to appeal against this decision. To the relief of Max and John, we did not publicly question it. An open protest would reveal that our boss was completely unaware of what the initials DNA stood for. Our acceptance of all this did not come, however, from a desire to keep peace with Bragg. Staying quiet made sense because we were in deep trouble with models based on sugar phosphate backbones. No matter how we looked at them, they did not seem right. On the day following the visit from King's, we looked carefully at both the unfortunate 3-chain model and a number of possible alternatives. We could not be sure, but we had the impression that any model placing the sugar phosphate backbone in the centre of a helix forced atoms closer together than the laws of chemistry allowed. Positioning one atom the proper distance from its neighbour often caused a distant atom to be placed impossibly close to its partners. A new start would be necessary to get the problem moving again. Sadly, however, we realized that our suddenly spoiled relationship with King's would remove our source of new experimental results. Further invitations to talks on their work were not to be expected, and any questioning of Morris would make him suspicious that we had returned to the problem. What was worse was the almost total certainty that they would not start to build models now that we had stopped. To our knowledge, King's had not built any models of the necessary atoms. Our offer to speed up that task by giving them the Cambridge equipment for making the models was not enthusiastically received. Morris did say, though, that within a few weeks someone might be found to put something together, and it was arranged that the next time one of us went down to London, the equipment could be dropped off at their laboratory. So the chances that anyone on the British side of the Atlantic would solve DNA looked small as the Christmas holidays approached. Though Francis went back to proteins, he did not enjoy simply keeping Bragg happy by working towards his PhD. Instead, after a few days of comparative silence, he began to talk about the alpha helix itself being arranged as part of a larger helix. I could only be sure that he would talk about DNA during the lunch hour. Fortunately, John Kendrew understood that the ban on working on DNA did not extend to thinking about it. At no time did he try to re-interest me in his work on proteins. Instead, I used the cold and dark days to learn more theoretical chemistry, or to look through journals, hoping that possibly there existed a forgotten clue to DNA. Chapter 7. TMV and RNA. I did not sit through the Christmas holidays in Cambridge. Avrion Mitchison had invited me and my sister Elizabeth to Carradale, his parents' home in Scotland. This was real luck, since over holidays, Av's mother Naomi, the famous writer, and his father, a politician, were known to fill their large home with odd mixtures of intelligent people. Moreover, Naomi was a sister of England's cleverest and most eccentric biologist, J.B.S. Haldane. Neither the feeling that our DNA work had hit a roadblock, nor the uncertainty of getting paid for the year was of much concern when I joined Av and his sister Val at Euston Station. No seats were left on the overnight Glasgow train, giving us a 10-hour journey seated on luggage, listening to Val comment on the dull, rude habits of the Americans, who each year come to Oxford in increasing numbers. At Glasgow we found my sister, who had flown in from Copenhagen. Dick Mitchison met our bus and drove us the 30 hilly kilometres to the tiny Scottish fishing village where he and Naomi had lived for the past 20 years. Dinner was still going on as we came out of a stone passage into a dining room dominated by sharp, confident talk. Av's scientist brother Murdoch had already come, and he enjoyed talking to people about how cells divide. More often, the subject was politics and the awkward relationship with Russia, the fault of American politicians who should be back in the law offices of Midwestern towns. By the following morning, I was aware that the best way not to feel impossibly cold was to remain in bed or, when that became impossible, to go walking, unless the rain was pouring down. In the afternoons, Dick was trying to get someone to shoot pigeons, but after one attempt, when I fired the gun after the pigeons were out of sight, I spent my time lying on the living room floor as close as possible to the fire. There was also the warming attraction of going to the library to play table tennis beneath the artist Wyndham Lewis's drawings of Naomi and her children. More than a week passed before I slowly began to understand that a family with Labour Party connections could be bothered by the way their guests were dressed. Naomi and several of the women dressed for dinner, but I considered this odd behaviour to be a sign of approaching old age. The thought never occurred to me that my own appearance was noticed, since my hair was beginning to lose its American shortness. Odile had been very shocked when Max introduced me to her on my first day in Cambridge, and afterwards had told Francis that a hairless American was coming to work in the laboratory. The best way to improve the situation was to avoid a hairdresser until I looked like other men in Cambridge. Though my sister was upset when she saw me, I knew that months, if not years, might be required to replace her shallow values with those of English intellectuals. So Carradale was the perfect environment to go one step further and acquire a beard. I did not like its reddish colour, but shaving in cold water was painful. But after a week of Val's and Murdoch's negative comments, as well as the expected unpleasantness of my sister, I came down for dinner with a clean face. When Naomi made an approving remark about my looks, I knew I had made the right decision. In the evenings, there was no way to avoid intellectual games, which gave the greatest advantage to a large vocabulary. Every time my weak contribution was read, I wanted to sink behind the chair rather than face the pitying looks of the Mitchison women. To my relief, the large number of house guests never permitted my turn to come often, and I always sat near the evening's box of chocolates, hoping no one would notice that I never passed it. Much more pleasant were the hours playing party games in the dark, twisting passages of the upstairs floors. The most determined of the game's enthusiasts was Ab's sister Lois, then just back from teaching for a year in Karachi. Almost from the start of my stay, I knew that I would leave Naomi's and Dick's friends with the greatest of regret. My departure 3 days after the New Year had been fixed by an arrangement for me to speak at a London meeting of the Society for Experimental Biology. 2 days before my departure there was a heavy fall of snow, giving the lifeless hills the look of Antarctic mountains. It was a perfect occasion for a long afternoon walk along the closed Campbelltown Road, with Av talking about his PhD experiments while I thought about the possibility that the road might still be blocked on the day I had to leave. The climate was not with me, however, because a group from the house caught the boat from Tarbet, and the next morning we were in London. On my return to Cambridge, I had expected to hear from the States about whether I would receive any more money, but there was no official letter there. Since Luria had written to me in November not to worry, the absence of firm news was now disturbing. Apparently no decision had been made, and I expected the worst. However, this would only be annoying. John and Max assured me that a small English grant could be found if I was completely without money. Only in late January did the uncertainty end, with the arrival of a letter from Washington. I was sacked. The letter said that money was only available for work in the permitted place. Because I had moved from Copenhagen, they had no choice. The second paragraph gave me the news that I had been given a completely new amount of money. This was not for the usual 12-month period, but ended after 8 months, in the middle of May. My real punishment for not following the board's advice and going to Stockholm was losing $1,000. By this time, it was almost impossible to obtain any support which could begin before the September start of a new university year. I naturally accepted the offer. $2,000 was not to be thrown away. Because I was not allowed to do anything with DNA, I decided to spend my time usefully by working on TMV, a virus that affects tobacco. An important part of TMV was nucleic acid, so it was the perfect disguise for my continuing interest in DNA. It was true that the nucleic acid part was not DNA itself, but a second form of nucleic acid known as ribonucleic acid, RNA. However, the difference was actually an advantage, since Morris could put forward no claim to RNA. If we solved RNA, we might also provide the important clue to DNA. On the other hand, TMV was thought to have a molecular weight of 40 million, and at first glance should be much more difficult to understand than the smaller molecules that John and Max had been working on for years without obtaining biologically interesting answers. Moreover, TMV had previously been looked at with X-rays by J.D. Bernal and I. Pfannkuchen. This was scary, since the power of Bernal's brain was famous, and I could never hope to have his understanding of crystallographic theory. I was even unable to understand large sections of their great paper published just after the start of the war. Though the theoretical basis for many of their conclusions was weak, the lesson to be learned was obvious. TMV was constructed from a large number of similar subunits. How the subunits were arranged they did not know. Moreover, 1939 was too early to begin thinking about the fact that the protein and RNA parts were likely to be constructed in very different ways. By now, however, protein subunits were easy to imagine in large numbers. Just the opposite was true of RNA. Division of the RNA part into a large number of subunits would produce nucleotide chains too small to carry the genetic information that Francis and I believed must be contained in the viral RNA. The most believable theory for the TMV structure was a central RNA column surrounded by a large number of similar small protein subunits. In fact, there already existed biochemical evidence for protein building blocks. Experiments of the German Gerhard Schramm, first published in 1944, reported that TMV viruses could be broken down into free RNA, and a large number of protein molecules which were similar, if not exactly alike. Almost nobody outside Germany, however, thought that Schramm's story was right. This was because of the war. It was unbelievable to most people that the Nazis would have permitted the extensive experiments that supported his claims to be routinely carried out during the last years of a war they were so badly losing. It was too easy to imagine that the work had direct Nazi support, and that his experiments were incorrectly analyzed. Most biochemists did not want to waste time disproving Schramm. As I read Bernal's paper, however, I suddenly became enthusiastic about Schramm. If he had misunderstood his data by accident, he had hit upon the right answer. It was possible that a few additional X-ray pictures would tell us how the protein subunits were arranged. This was particularly true if they were put together helically. Excitedly, I borrowed Bernal's and Van Kuken's paper from the Philosophical Library and brought it to the laboratory so that Francis could inspect the TMV X-ray picture. When he saw the blank areas that indicate helical patterns, he jumped into action, quickly suggesting several possible helical TMV structures. From this moment, I knew I could no longer avoid actually understanding the helical theory. Waiting until Francis had free time to help me would save me from having to master the mathematics, but only at the cost of making no progress if Francis was out of the room. Luckily, only a general understanding was needed to see why the TMV X-ray picture suggested a helix with a turn every 2300 millionths of a centimetre along its length. The rules were, in fact, very simple. This time, however, Francis did not become enthusiastic, and in the following days maintained that the evidence for a TMV helix was not strong. My spirits automatically sank, until I thought of a perfect reason why subunits should be helically arranged. I had read a Faraday Society discussion paper on the structure of metals, which contained a clever theory by F.C. Frank on how crystals grow. Every time the calculations were properly done, the odd answer appeared that the crystals could not grow at the observed rates. Frank saw that the problem disappeared if the crystals were not as regular as suspected, but contained cracks resulting in the presence of corners into which the molecules could fit. Several days later, on the bus to Oxford, the idea came to me that each tiny piece of TMV should be thought of as a tiny crystal, growing like other crystals, because it had corners. More importantly, the simplest way to produce corners was to have the subunits helically arranged. The idea was so simple that it had to be right. Every helical staircase I saw that weekend in Oxford made me more confident that other biological structures would also have helical shapes. Francis, however, remained neutral, and in the absence of any hard facts, I knew I could not change his mind. Hugh Huxley came to my rescue by offering to teach me how to set up the X-ray camera for photographing TMV. The way to reveal a helix was to turn the TMV so that it was at several different angles to the X-ray beam. Van Kuken had not done this, since before the war no one took helices seriously. So I went to Roy Markham to see if any spare TMV was available. Markham then worked in a laboratory which, unlike all the others in Cambridge, was well heated. This unusual state came from the poor health of its director, David Kylin. I always welcomed an excuse to exist temporarily at 20 degrees centigrade, although I was never sure when Markham would start the conversation by saying how bad I looked, implying that if I had been brought up on English beer, I would not be in this poor condition. This time he was unexpectedly sympathetic, and without hesitation offered some virus. The idea of Francis and me dirtying our hands with experiments amused him greatly. My first X-ray pictures revealed, not unexpectedly, much less detail than was found in the published pictures. Over a month was required before I could get even fairly presentable pictures. They were still a long way, though, from being good enough to show a helix. Then came the news that Linus Pauling was coming to London in May for a meeting organised by the Royal Society on the structure of proteins. One could never be sure where he would strike next. Particularly alarming was the possibility that he might ask to visit kings. Chapter 8. Chargaff's Rules. Linus, however, was prevented from descending on London. His trip was suddenly ended through the removal of his passport. The US State Department did not want troublemakers like Pauling wandering around saying nasty things about the politics of its former investment bankers who were resisting the godless Russians. Failure to control Pauling might result in a London press conference with him arguing for a peaceful world. Francis and I were already in London when the story reached the Royal Society. The reaction was one of almost complete disbelief. The failure to let one of the world's leading scientists attend a completely non-political meeting would have been expected from the Russians. A top Russian might easily decide to stay in the richer West. No danger existed, however, that Linus might want to run away. Only complete satisfaction with their Caltech existence came from him and his family. The disaster was no surprise to several of us who had just been in Oxford for a meeting on the nature of viral multiplication. One of the main speakers would have been Luria. 2 weeks prior to his flight to London, he was informed that he would not get a passport. As usual, the State Department would not say why. Luria's absence meant that I got the job of describing the recent experiments of the American bacterial virus workers. There was no need to put together a speech. Several days before the meeting, Al Hershey sent me a long letter from Cold Spring Harbor, summarizing the recently completed experiments by which he and Martha Chase had shown that a key feature of the infection of a bacterium by a bacterial virus was the injection of the viral DNA into the host bacterium. More importantly, very little protein entered the bacterium. Their experiment was therefore a powerful new proof that DNA is the primary genetic material. In spite of this, almost no one in the audience of over 400 biologists seemed interested as I read long sections of Hershey's letter. Obvious exceptions were André Lvov, Seymour Benzer, and Gunther Stent, all visiting briefly from Paris. They knew that Hershey's experiments were important and that everyone would now start to emphasize DNA. To most of the audience, however, Hershey's name meant very little. Moreover, when it came out that I was an American, my uncut hair provided no assurance that my scientific judgment was not equally eccentric. If Lvov had not been present, the meeting would have been a total failure. André was sympathetic to my belief that ions were highly important for nucleic acid structure. There was no hint at the meeting that anyone at King's had mentioned ions since the disagreement with Francis and me in early December. When I spoke to Morris, I learned that the equipment for building the molecular models had not been touched since arriving at his laboratory. The time had not yet come to ask Rosie and Gosling to start building models. The quarrelling between Morris and Rosie was even more bitter than before the visit to Cambridge. Now she was insisting that her data told her DNA was not a helix. Instead of building helical models at Morris's command, she might twist the wire models round his neck. When Morris asked whether we needed the equipment back in Cambridge, we said yes, half implying that more carbon atoms were needed to make models showing how alpha helix chains turn corners. To my relief, Morris was very open about what was not happening at King's. The fact that I was doing serious X-ray work with TMV assured him that I would not soon become interested in the DNA pattern. Morris had no suspicion that almost immediately I would get the X-ray picture needed to prove that TMV was helical. My unexpected success came from using a powerful new X-ray tube, which had just been built in the Cavendish. This permitted me to take pictures 20 times faster than before. Within a week, I more than doubled the number of my X-ray photographs. One midsummer June night, I went back to the laboratory to shut down the X-ray tube and to develop a new TMV photograph. It was leaning over at about 25 degrees, so that if I were lucky, I would find the helical reflections. The moment I held the still wet negative against the light box, I knew we had it. The helical marks were unmistakable. Now there should be no problem in persuading Luria and Delbruck that it made sense for me to stay in Cambridge. Despite the midnight hour, I had no desire to go back to my room, and I walked happily along the riverside for over an hour. The following morning, I waited anxiously for Francis's arrival to confirm the helical conclusion. When he needed less than 10 seconds to see the significant reflection, all my remaining doubts disappeared. It was now clear what we should do next. No more benefits would come quickly from TMV. Further exploration of its detailed structure needed a more professional approach than I was capable of. Moreover, it was not obvious that even the most back-breaking effort would give within several years the structure of the RNA part of the virus. The way to DNA was not through TMV. So the moment was appropriate to think seriously about some curious regularities in DNA chemistry, first observed at Columbia by the Austrian-born biochemist Erwin Chargaff. Since the war, Chargaff and his students had been carefully analyzing various examples of DNA for the amounts, in relation to each other, of their purine, A and G, and pyrimidine, C and T, bases. In all their DNA preparations, the number of A molecules was very similar to the number of T molecules, while the number of G molecules was very close to the number of C molecules. Moreover, the amount of A and T in relation to C and G, varied with the biological origin. The DNA of some life forms had an excess of A and T, while in other life forms there was an excess of G and C. No explanation for his interesting results was offered by Chargaff, though he obviously thought they were significant. When I first reported them to Francis, they did not cause any reaction, and he went on thinking about other matters. Soon afterwards, however, the suspicion that the regularities were important grew inside his head, as the result of several conversations with the young theoretical chemist John Griffith. One occurred while they were drinking beer one evening after attending a scientific talk. Knowing that Griffith was interested in theoretical schemes for genes copying themselves, Francis suggested that it might be possible for a gene to copy itself exactly when the chromosome number doubles during cell division. Griffith, however, did not agree, since for some months he had preferred a scheme where gene copying was based on the alternative creation of opposite surfaces that could fit together. This was not an original idea. It had been around for almost 30 years among theoretical geneticists. The argument said that this required the creation of a new negative shape where the shape was related to the original positive surface, like a lock to a key. The negative would then use its shape to produce a new positive surface. A smaller number of geneticists could not accept this idea. But Pauling hated the idea of direct copying. Just before the war, he asked Delbruck to join him in writing a note to Science, firmly stating their belief in a method of gene copying which involved the production of positive and negative shapes. Neither Francis nor Griffith was satisfied for long that evening by talking about old ideas. Both knew that the important task was to identify the attracting forces. Francis forcefully argued that hydrogen bonds were not the answer. They could not hold things in the same place, since our chemist friends repeatedly told us that the hydrogen atoms in both types of base did not have fixed positions, but wandered from one spot to another. Instead, Francis had the feeling that DNA copying involved particular attracting forces between the surfaces of the bases. Luckily, this was the sort of force that Griffith might be able to calculate. If the positive-negative scheme was right, he might find attracting forces between bases with different structures. On the other hand, if direct copying existed, his calculations might reveal attraction between bases of the same type. So, when the pub closed, they parted with the understanding that Griffith would see if the calculations were possible. When they met again several days later, Francis learned that there was some evidence that A and T bases should stick to each other by their flat surfaces. A similar argument could be made for attracting forces between G and C bases. Francis immediately jumped at the answer. If his memory was correct, these were the pairs of bases that Chargaff had shown to occur in equal amounts. Excitedly, he told Griffith that I had recently mentioned some odd results of Chargaff's. At the moment, though, he was not sure that the same base pairs were involved. But as soon as the data was checked, he would come round to Griffith's rooms and let him know. At lunch, I confirmed that Francis had got Chargaff's results right. But by then, he was only routinely enthusiastic as he thought about Griffith's mechanical arguments. Griffith, when put under pressure, did not want to defend his exact reasoning too strongly. He had ignored too many items which might change so that he could make the calculations in a reasonable time. Moreover, though each base had two flat sides, no explanation existed for why only one side would be chosen. There was, in addition, Roy Markham's assurance that if Chargaff said that G equaled C, he was equally certain that it did not. In Markham's eyes, Chargaff's experimental methods inevitably underestimated the true amount of C. In spite of this, Francis was not ready to drop Griffith's scheme when, early in July, John Kendrew walked into our newly acquired office to tell us that Chargaff himself would soon be in Cambridge for an evening. John had arranged for him to have dinner at Peterhouse, and Francis and I were invited to join them later for drinks in John's room. At dinner in the college, John kept the conversation away from serious matters, only mentioning the possibility that Francis and I were going to solve the DNA structure by model building. Chargaff, as one of the world's experts on DNA, was not at first amused by unknown scientists trying to win the race. Only when John mentioned that I was not a typical American did he realize that he was going to listen to a madman. When he saw me, he knew he was right. Immediately, he criticized my hair and accent. Since I came from Chicago, I had no right to act otherwise. Telling him that I kept my hair long to avoid confusion with American Air Force personnel only proved my mental instability. The high point in Chargaff's superiority came when he led Francis into admitting that he did not remember the chemical difference between the four bases. His later remark that he could always look them up did not persuade Chargaff that we knew where we were going or how to get there. But however much Chargaff looked down on us, someone had to explain his results. So the next afternoon Francis went over to Griffith's rooms in Trinity to get his ideas clear about the base pair data. Hearing, "Come in," he opened the door and saw Griffith with a girl. Realising that this was not the moment for science, he slowly moved back through the door, asking Griffith to tell him again the pairs produced by his calculations. After writing them down on the back of an envelope, he left. Since I had departed that morning for continental Europe, his next stop was the Philosophical Library, where he could remove his remaining doubts about Chargaff's data. Then, with both sets of information clear in his mind, he considered returning to Griffith's rooms. But on second thoughts, he realised that Griffith's interests were in another area. It was obvious that the presence of attractive young women does not inevitably lead to a scientific future.